All right, folks, welcome. Good afternoon or good morning, good evening, depending on where you're watching us from. Hoping people are able to join us live. We'll see how that goes. This is Jeremy Grandstaff with SGE Endeavors, and I want to welcome you to the rebranded SGE Connections. SGE Connections is the new Coffee with Jeremy for those of you who used to join us and grab coffee with us. Instead, now we're just worried more about connecting you to the best practices and the knowledge that you need to be able to make your work more effective, to give you an opportunity to hear from some of our clients here at SGE Endeavors, some of the great work they've been doing and about some of their successes, and to help SGE clients understand what we can do at SGE Endeavors to help you. I guess that goes for potential clients too. And so I want to welcome you all to the rebranded SGE Connections. And why are we here today? Well, I am actually joined by three people that I actually consider what I would say is outstanding people. All of the people that are joining us today have played a key role in helping our company be successful by doing the work that they do in their own companies or organizations that they work with. And so I'm excited to be joined today by Brian Coyle, who's from the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services. Jen Hansen is joining us. Jennifer, do you want Jen or Jennifer? I guess I probably should ask that before we went live, Jen.
Either one is fine.
Either one is fine. So we'll say Jen Hansen from Public Health Solutions, also in Nebraska. And then Mary Fernandez, who is a consultant and a great friend of mine who works a lot in disability rights and advocacy rights and web accessibility. And so Mary, Brian, and Jennifer, I'm glad you guys are joining me today. Why are they joining me? Because we're going to take a dive into the topic of small group dialogue and how it helps you create a deeper level of conversation and moreover increases the buy-in and commitment to what you're getting from the participants that you work with, whether it be in meetings or change that you're leading in your organization. And so I'm really glad that the three of you are joining me today. We'll basically dive into the topic a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done with each of my panelists today, and then we will just kind of open up the discussion, have some dialogue about what we've learned along the way, and moreover, give you an opportunity for those of you who are joining live or may want to even tweet in your questions. We'll answer those toward the end of our broadcast. Remember, you can send in your questions by doing hashtag SGE Connections. That's hashtag SGE Connections. You can do that on Facebook, Twitter, and Jerry is going to be pulling up the Facebook page, and we'll be looking for those to come by. And so I appreciate you, Jerry, for doing that. And John is running our background stuff, which is helping us broadcast live. So we've got a great team here with you today. I'm really excited to get into talking about why we chose dialogue and small group collaboration. So let's move into our topic, and then I'm going to start talking about, again, Brian, Jen, and Mary, and some of the work that we've been working on with them. So I'm always asked, what is the best way to create that long-term change that we want to do, and what's the best way to get people engaged? How do we make sure that people aren't just going to walk away after we have this meeting? What I usually will get is, how can I create a strong enough plan that people are going to actually engage in it and help it become successful? I know even when we started working with you, Brian, on the Nebraska Walkable Communities Initiative, one of the first things that you and I had a conversation about is, what can we do from a process perspective to make sure that we're thinking long-term sustainability and it's being used as a way to engage the community in planning what they want to work on, and more importantly, implementing it after they plan it. And so I really feel that the key to that, there's two pieces that I think are critical. The first is small group dialogue. And the second, I think, is the design team. And we'll talk more about the design team in January. But for today, I thought, let's have some conversation about how we've used dialogue and small group dialogue specifically as a way to really help an organization or a community as they are looking to increase the buy-in from the people that they're working with, working to increase that ownership that is found at the community level or even organizational level if you're talking about organization planning, that really gets people meaningfully participating. And that's another key to success, is being able to use a method that's going to engage them meaningfully, not just because you want them to feel like they're engaged. It's a big pet peeve of mine when I hear people saying something like, I want them to feel like they care, or like I care about their ideas. You don't want them to feel it, you want them to know it. And the way that you do that is through increasing their meaningful participation in the process. And by doing all of those things, by using small groups and dialogue in the fashion that we use with our clients, you're going to be able to see that increase, especially the increase in the overall success of what you're doing, because you have the increased buy-in and ownership from people. So that, I think, is a bit of an overview. And what I want to do now is almost dive in to talking with my guests today. And I thought what we would do, actually, Jen, if you're okay with it, I'd love to start with you and just dive into talking about Hebron, Nebraska, and some of the things that we've worked on in Hebron. And so what I'll do is I'll give a little bit of an overview, folks, of what we've done. And then, Jen, I'm going to ask you to kind of chime in with some of the things that you've learned along the way, and maybe some of the things that you feel have worked really well as we've been working with Hebron. And Jen actually is fortunate, well, I don't know, fortunate, unfortunate, depending on how you want to describe it, to work with us on 3 different communities, Hebron, Fairbury, and Beatrice, which all exist in is that, Jen, considered East Central Nebraska? Is that how we would describe that?
We're just a little bit west of southeast, so pretty southeast still.
And all of those communities are in various stages of working with us on the Nebraska Walkable Communities Initiative. And Hebron was one of the first communities that we worked with. So, Jen, before I get into what we did with Hebron, tell us a little bit, if you don't mind, about just maybe a minute or so about the Hebron community.
Sure. The Hebron community is a small, very small rural community. They have about 2,000 people who live there. They are very community-based. They are kind of, a large family. They're centered around their school system. The kids are a main focus. They have a small hospital there, a community center, and they really are very invested in improving the community in which they live for their future and their children's future. So.
Awesome, Jen. That was really good. And essentially, the goal with Hebron is we had to come up with some type of a planning process that was going to engage as many people as we could in the community and really get them to own it, as Jen is saying. They're very focused on the community ownership of things. So what we did is we worked them through, I would say, kind of a standard planning process where we met with a design team, probably had about 10 to 12 people, if I'm not mistaken, on the design team. We brought them together, and their job was to really start talking about what does it mean to increase walking and biking in Hebron and kind of start that conversation. But it was also to engage a larger slice of the community in their conversation at a further summit. Now, I find it fascinating as I've been working on the projects in Nebraska, and you'll hear me say this a lot, it's always about meeting the community where they are. And we really do try to use something called open space theory, which really says the right people are going to be the people who show up. And in Hebron, we had 3 we had 30 people show up. And when I did the math, it came out to, I think it was like 1% of the community. I might have that a little low, actually. And Jen, feel free to correct me. But we had that turnout, and they came together and they heard from a panel on increasing walking and biking, what that might look like, and what were some of the opportunities that might exist. And then they would get to break into small groups, and they would talk about what they heard and come back and ask really strong questions that got the panel to talk further. And then we created, again, some small group dialogue around 3 or 4 topics that the group identified or come up with on their own. And they did some brainstorming around them, and people could roam from group to group. So it was interesting to see the different dynamics and the way that the group, the small groups would break out and then kind of change in energy-wise, or even seeing some of the ideas that might get generating out of that brainstorming activity. And then they, again, divided into small groups and completed action plans for each of the topic areas that they had been discussing. So we didn't just stop at, let's brainstorm a bunch of ideas, but we created some action plans and gave people the opportunity before they left that day to literally vote to prioritize. I think, if I remember right, Jen, it was the top 4. No, it was the top 6 actions that they wanted to see. And then after that summit where we heard from the community, their leadership team came back and said, okay, what is the top actions that we need to focus on? One of the things that we learned, this is very early in the Nebraska Walkable Communities phase, is the community really, especially Hebron, they really wanted to be driven a lot by a vision, kind of an overall arching thing. And for them, their action plans that they had developed led back to connecting and creating a more connected trail system. Now, Jen, I know these guys have really exceeded at implementation, and I'm wondering if you might give us a couple highlights on that, and then maybe even just start talking about what you've learned from the process, or what you like from the process that we put them through, why you felt it worked. I almost want to step back and give you an opportunity to reflect a little bit as well. So first for us, Jen, what is some of the big ahas or big successes that they've had? Since their summit.
Jeremy, I would say some of the biggest successes were, number one was just that they gave everyone kind of an equal voice, and were just willing to entertain any ideas that kept coming up. That's one thing I loved about the process, is that if an idea was something that was going to work for the community, it kept coming up over and over again, and if it wasn't, it just kind of died away, throughout the process. And Jeremy would continually tell me, trust the process, trust the process. Whoever is supposed to be here is supposed to be here, and what comes out of it is what's supposed to come out of it. And like you said, the connectivity theme kept coming up, the safety for, and then just keeping Hebron a place where they would want to live and where their children would want to live and come back to. I guess I think that's some of the biggest things that came out of it success-wise. I would say one of the panelists that came that day, we were lucky enough to have somebody who's worked extensively on fundraising and designing trails in some of the more metropolitan areas in the state, which not necessarily huge metropolitan areas, but a larger city, that had really good successes with fundraising and designing those trails. And we were able to have him come and speak to the group, and I will never forget that one of the things that kept coming up was funding. Hebron had been through a similar process in the future, not a similar process, but a similar situation where they wanted to implement some trails, and they kind of got stuck in the weeds. They got stuck in some engineering issues, and were never able to get beyond just a very small portion of trail that ended up going nowhere in the town. And I think that was sort of a sore spot with them, is that this was something they wanted to do for their community, and it just kept standing out that they weren't able to achieve it. They weren't able to get that connectivity that they, had wanted. And one of the things that that panelist said was that they asked him, how do we get the funding for this? How do we make this happen? This is great. We have this plan in place, but how do we get this to happen? And he said, the way you get money out of people is to turn them upside down and shake them. And I laughed when he said that, but essentially that's what the Hebron community has done, is just they've asked for it. They've gone to different sources and they've gone to different community organizations, different partners that would be available to them, and they just asked. And they said they had this action plan. They had this great community-based group that has come together and continued to meet, and it gave them a really strong basis for getting that funding. And like you said, the right people showed up that day at the summit, and from there they just kind of powered forward.
I think that's really cool. And I always talk about Hebron because they really used, and I talk about this in our work, Jen, a lot. Thanks. They really do a good job of tapping into the power of small community, and they do a good job of exemplifying how you take an action plan and you use it to actually go get funding. And I think that's the key. I made this joke, and we're gonna move over to you, Mary, and bring Mary into the conversation with us, and then Brian will bring you in last. But I always joke with people, and I do this. It's kind of a joke, but it's really not. When I used to work for the Alliance for Biking and Walking, the biggest call that I would get would be, "You need to help us raise money. I need help raising money." And I'd say, "What's your mission? What's your vision? What are your goals? Where's your organization be in 3 to 5 years?" And their answer was always, "No, you don't understand. We'll get the money and then we'll figure that out." And Hebron is a good example that it is completely the opposite. You make your plan and then you use that as a way to go after the funding that you need. And Jen, before I move on, and we'll come back to all of us at the end, but I just want to say you have done an excellent job of being able to use all the plans that are being developed by the communities to go after those grant fundings as well. So I just wanted to take a second and pay homage to your work and what you're doing there as well. Let's jump over to Mary Fernandez. Mary, I actually met in the past year, and we had the fortunate opportunity to work with each other on a workshop for the National Federation of the Blind of Virginia. Our workshop that we put together was on collaboration. So I figured, Mary, worst case scenario, we just talked about the workshop, and because it does fall into looking at how we've used small group activities in a way to get people engaged in those conversations. Just kind of taking a step back, you've probably seen on the SNG Endeavors blog, we've done some significant volunteer work with National Federation of the Blind of Virginia, and it's one of the things that we like to try to do to give back to the community. And so we've led leadership development workshops for their board, for example, or even some exploration around strategic planning and what that might look like. But I love when we get an opportunity to really help to teach and to help to train people on how to think about being more collaborative. And I know, Mary, you and I put this awesome workshop together. And I think in my head, I don't know about you, and feel free to just start jumping in when you want, but I really thought we were going to have more than 50 people in the room. And we ended up with, I think, 12.
Yeah.
And so I remember at one point when I noticed that we were just going to do this workshop for 12 people, ironically, Jen, we were just talking about, the right people will show up. And I still got in my head as a facilitator and was like, wow, only 12 people? I can't believe that. And then as we started going through and talking about things and really presenting the topic, I'm like, you know what? That was the right 12 people to come and to have that conversation. Essentially what we did with our design is we did a panel. So we did kind of kick it off a little bit like they did in Hebron. And our workshop was really designed to be more teaching about collaboration, how you could use collaboration in the workplace in order to empower yourself as a blind person. And so we kicked off with a panel, and there were some people who talked about successful stories of collaboration and how that was, how they had managed to come through things like working on collaborative documents, even though sometimes as a blind person you don't have the ability to see them. Or just kind of also thinking about, I think, Mary, you talked, if I remember right, about just ways that you have collaboratively worked in the consulting that you've been doing with web accessibility, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did our panel, and then we broke them into small groups, kind of like what we did in Hebron. And we said, talk about what you heard from the panel, what your reactions were, and what questions of understanding you have. And notice the wording is really the key there. What questions of understanding do you have that'll help us maybe tell you more or get you more information? One of the fascinating things out of this workshop for me, and there's always something that comes out of a workshop to fascinate me, is we had one small group out of the 12 people were really focused and representative of the military.
Yeah.
And so it kind of reminded me about something that Brian Coyle, who we'll bring into the conversation in just a minute, always says, which is you have to meet them where they're at. You have to be willing to meet each community where they're at. And for this particular place, I distinctly remember as we were having conversations, and we even ran them through a small group activity where they could try to apply what they had learned, and we gave them each a case study where they could try to come up with a way that they might apply collaboration in their thing. Their particular answer, they really struggled with this idea of it being driven from the bottom, and we had to really kind of spend a lot of time talking about how can you be collaborative and still be the military, and what does that look like? And Mary, I think I'll stop there because I want to give you a chance to reflect a little bit on some of the things that you took away from the way that we used collaboration and dialogue and got them talking to each other, and just kind of your overall impressions of what you took away from the workshop.
Sure. So I think that one of the first things that, we had 12 people, so the room kind of naturally broke up into small groups, and we didn't really, as facilitators, have to do anything about that. However, we kind of failed to foresee the fact that alike people are going to stick together. So we had all the militaries on one table and all the non-militaries on the other table. And it was really funny because it became this thing where they're like, well, in the military, things just don't work like that. Like, you just don't collaborate. You just do what you do, what you're told to do. And it was really funny to me. I'm like, maybe we should have tried to mix them up a bit so that within their groups, there was a diversity of thought and understanding. I think it was really valuable to have case studies where they got to apply some of the concepts that we spoke about. And because, it's really easy, even if you're discussing what you have heard, to kind of fall into this hole, but this doesn't really apply in real life anyway. So that was a nice workshop, but, I don't see this working for me at any point. So I think that having the case studies really made it possible to connect it into what would happen in real life and what some of the challenges would be in a real work setting. So I think that was really valuable.
Yeah, and you know what, Mary, you hit on two things that I think are so critical. And a lot of time, the first one is the assignment of groups, right? How do you break people into small groups? Had I had that to do over again, I probably would have had them actually randomize it, right? And done it that way. But it was a very interesting thing because I do have some clients who will push back on that and say, no, we'll just let people sit with who you are. And you really have to be careful when you're using small group dialogue to make sure that you are creating a situation where each of your small groups do represent the whole of the group that's in there. Sometimes that can be harder for a training that you don't know who's going to come to until they get there. And the other thing, Mary, that I thought you hit on was especially a training technique that we use in our training that we do here in SNG Endeavors. And it's really that idea that we're not just going to talk to you and then let you ask questions. We want you to be able to apply it before you leave. And I know as I transition us over to Brian Coyle and bring him into the conversation, I know that, Brian, this is something that as we've been working on even some of the training that we've done for the Nebraska Walkable Communities Initiative, it always has that component to it. Sometimes it's a action planning component at the end of the training if we've got a group of people who are ready to create their plan to move forward. Sometimes it's a, we need to convince people why they should come on board with what we're training on as a topic. And so therefore we're going to spend some time talking about messaging and created messaging as we did with the Grand Island Complete Streets training. But one of the things that I wanted to really focus on with Brian today, and Brian, I want to thank you for coming on. You've been on the show when it was back as Coffee with Jeremy. And we haven't had you on to talk about the Nebraska Walkable Communities Initiative for over a year now, and so I'm excited to have you back. One of the things that I wanted to focus on with Brian is the steering committee. And ironically, Jen is also a member of the steering committee, so it might be interesting to just, as we open that up for all dialogue, to think about that piece. And Jen, if you think we're missing anything. But the steering committee for the Nebraska Walkable Communities Initiative has been really critical to our success. And part of that is how we work with them. So Brian, just in case we've got some first-time listeners, give us a 1-minute spiel on what I'm talking about when I say the Nebraska Walkable Communities Initiative. Is this like some major funded thing or something that's happening in Nebraska?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think a minute is more than enough time to really talk about it. But before I do, just kudos to Jen and the work she's doing through Public Health Solutions with Hebron. It's what makes this project what it is today are the local champions and the health educators in the local health departments who are actually doing that work and working hand in hand with local leaders. So kudos to Jen, and I'm glad she's able to share her story. Really, the Walkable Communities Initiative is really two different pieces. One is the steering committee, as Jeremy had mentioned, which is really identifying local champions and leaders who know a lot about walking, biking, and overall health, and really coming together to identify who those key partners are, to then support the local communities that I'll mention here in a second to implement the Walkable Communities Initiative, which means providing training, technical assistance, opportunities to funding, connecting partners and resources. One of the great things that the steering committee has done is develop a complete streets training that's Nebraska specific. But then you have the Nebraska Walkable Communities Initiative community component, which actually is this whole project is funded by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and we call it 1422. And it funds 6 local health departments that are trying to change health outcomes for high minority, high need populations across the state of Nebraska, which impacts high population centers like Omaha to the very rural communities like Jen had mentioned, Hebron, and out in our panhandle where there's frontier lands and you have one person for every 25 miles. And so trying to think health services and getting connected to prevention opportunities, it's really interesting. But we work with the 6 local health departments, and we are in 13 different communities across the state. And I will tell you, each of the 13 communities that we work with is a very different process. Similar groups of people that come together, similar conversations, but the backgrounds and the passion, the desires are all a little bit different because everybody comes from a different walk of life, a historical perspective, what they bring to the table, and we're really knocking it out of the park. And what I'll say is, and Jeremy, I'll jump back to you here, we originally pitched this project only work in 6 communities. But because the process was so successful and we had buy-in from the local health departments, we had other communities that were chomping at the bit who wanted to work with us, we expanded to 13 communities. So we're really excited that it went from 6, which we were going to work with the 6 over the 4-year grant process, but now we're in 13. And as Jeremy mentioned, each community is at a different stage.
Yeah, it's kind of like having 13 different local clients and one big client that everybody has to come into. Brian, one of the questions that I always get is, well, we've only got 20 people in the room. Do we really need to spend that much time in small groups? And why would we do that? And kind of made me, when I was thinking about small groups and dialogue, one of the things that I was thinking about was this concept that when we kicked off this project, I think at that time we identified 20 people to kick off the steering committee. And we brought them into a room and we had to figure out a way to quickly build connection within the group. And one of the things that I remember doing really well is putting our people into different groups, and each group having a state rep of some kind, or a state, like making sure that our groups were very diverse in the way that they came together. And we used that process, what sometimes we'll call in my line of work, the individual to the group to the whole. So I want your conversations in your smaller groups to give everybody an individual chance to share what's in their own head. And then looking at how do we now theme that in some way, or if it's action, we talk about prioritizing it. We brought these groups together. They did this small group work, and we walked out of that meeting with a clear strategic plan to guide the project for the next 4 years. Now, obviously, a strategic plan is a working document, so it obviously changes and it reworks itself. And each year we've done an in-person meeting where we've done that small group work as a way to transform the project and make sure that it's still moving in the right direction and in a strategic direction that is owned by everybody going through that process. And so there were 2 things that I remember thinking when I got that question. The first is, it doesn't matter how big the group is. At some point, we want to tap into that power of small groups as a way to give everybody an opportunity to participate. And I always like to joke and say, and everybody else an opportunity to fully engage and not at some point get bored by listening to 20 different people talk. But I just feel that it was the way we have utilized the steering committee and the way that we've always kept them in this break out and talk and then come back in and prioritize. It seems like that's been a key to what has made this work. And so I wanted to take a second to reflect on that and just give you an opportunity to talk about some of your other insights as you think about that small group and dialogue work. Maybe for you see it more in the community stuff, but I just feel that like we've been really good at adhering to that for the steering committee as well, to guide that work.
Yeah, and I would add that the process itself has actually been, I don't like to use the term loose, but it's been loose as we've actually brought in new partners. And so while we had 20 engaged leaders at the table, which we already had some established relationships with, the process itself allowed us to dig in deeper. So we focused on walking, biking, and overall health, which is the components that we do actually in the local communities, because we don't want to pin people in, because everybody comes with their ideas, their passions, their desires. But what I think the smaller group process has allowed us to do is really to dig deeper to say, hey, Health and Human Services has this project, but we want to know how that adds value to the work you're doing as an individual, but also as an organization. So just that and the conversations as we've continued to build the group itself, I think because we brought on major partners such as Department of Economic Development, AARP Nebraska, the Nebraska Department of Transportation, I think the process itself has really helped us to welcome them in and feel like they've always been a part of the process. So that's been a fantastic piece. I like the small group conversation just because that's just the nature of our work in Nebraska. These small groups can drive so many different conversations. As Jen talked about in Hebron, while we had 30 people at a community summit, which, by the way, represented an age group of middle schoolers all the way up to age 80, business owners, the mayor, city council, and just concerned citizens and students, you know, they bought into that process. So while we're modeling it at the steering committee level, that same model is rolling out into the community, and we're seeing it even continue to be more successful. And it creates that sustainability because everybody's voice is heard. One of the things when we first started this project with the steering committee and with the communities was, I didn't want this to be a DHHS project where we told communities what to do. There had to be the local buy-in from the outset, and us have that understanding of where communities are at to ensure that we meet them where they are going. Because we didn't want to pin people into the conversation of just walkability. You know, there's healthy food access issues, there's healthcare issues, there's no jobs, there's low-paying jobs. I mean, there's other issues within the community, and I'm thinking of Hastings, Jeremy, where part of their community summit, I think they identified 9 different areas of need that moved. One of them was walkability and bikeability, but it moved to healthy food access and smoke-free bars. And so we created the community dialogue, and I'll tell you, when the communities allow that to just build upon itself, they own it. And I think that's what the steering committee members have done too. They've owned the conversation, they're bought in, they see the value of what they can bring to the table, but they also see the value add to their local organization work as well.
It sounds very similar actually to a conversation that I was just having with the executive director of the DC Housing Authority as we were working with them on their senior team retreat and really thinking about how does he use that type of dialogue, that type of small group dialogue in a way to get the senior team owning their strategy. I've kind of always have looked at the senior team for the Nebraska Walkable Communities Initiative is more of that steering committee. One of the things that I think is great about that is that there is a huge representation on the steering committee that exists from the local health departments and local community leaders and things like that. And so I know that, to me, that's always been a key to the success of it. I want to bring us all in. So Jen and Mary and Brian, I'm curious, as we're listening to each other talk, and we'll be checking in with John and Jerry in the background there to see if we have other questions coming in. But are there questions that you have of each other as you were listening to some of the stuff we were talking about?
I don't have any at the moment.
Okay. John, let me check in with you on questions or viewers from the audience. Not that I necessarily want to hear if there's no viewers, but it's always nice to know if we've got any live questions coming in, and I'm going to double check on Twitter and Facebook as well. All right, and so I'm not getting anything on questions coming in. So we're gonna come back and just kind of check in with you guys as you're thinking about listening to some of the stuff that we've done and thinking about some of the things that we have talked about today. I'm gonna also come over to Jerry and ask if you've got questions that you might wanna ask. And Jerry has been playing a role in helping us craft and work on the social media pieces for this. And so, Jerry, I thought we might start with a question from you or John. We'll probably go you because I think it's easier for you to come off mute. But as you're listening to us talk today, Jerry, what's a question that you've got burning in your mind?
So my question would be knowing what you do and listening to each of the panelists, would be for Brian, how do you think your work and what you're doing is different using Jeremy's process as compared to the other two?
Well, the process is fairly similar in working with Jen at the local health departments. But what's different is the process itself is modifiable. And I think that's what's the most important piece, is that for what we do at the steering committee, it's a very similar template, but we switch it up and model it based on the outcomes of what we're trying to achieve with the upcoming meeting. We got an upcoming meeting in January, so Jeremy and I are doing a significant amount of planning to brainstorm and prepare us to write our next Center for Disease Control application. So we're trying to tailor the meeting and tailor the engagement, tailor the small group conversation to really get us to that brainstorming opportunity. To whereas the work we do in Hebron and Fairbury and Beatrice, that process is modifiable, and what's really important is we work very closely with the community to define how that process looks. So Hebron's process was different from Fairbury's, and Fairbury's is different from Beatrice as well, and that goes across the scale. And so I think from a process standpoint, the modifiability of the approach to get the buy-in, to get the ownership, to get the meaningful participation, that was an important component of where we're at today and how successful this project is already.
Awesome. And I'm not seeing any questions from the audience. So Jerry, we're going to keep coming to you. If you've got other questions for me, Jen, Mary, or Brian.
John, I had a question for Mary. Just can you tell me, like, what are some next steps for your project, and are you going to be using any of the small group stuff with any of your other groups that you might work with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I do is very flexible. I consult with different companies and kind of subcontract with some other companies to try to make their products more accessible, or which accessibility means that products, particularly in the web, are been able to use by people using assistive software, so people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So that can take a variety of ways to do. We can either do in-person trainings, or I write out best practices documents, which I have done. So it really depends on my client and what they're looking for. I'm hoping that in the new year I'll be working with some universities to do web accessibility with them, and definitely within the training portion of that, I will be using the small groups to, kind of develop understanding and to make sure that they're getting these concepts, because these are things that are brand new to people. But I think that using small groups is definitely something that you can use in all kinds of ways to impart all different kinds of knowledge.
Awesome.
Thanks.
And we're going to go to Jen for one quick question. And Jen, it's something that I was thinking about as I was prepping for this call. Like I said, Hebron was our first community. Fairbury has been the second community that you and I have worked together. And then in Beatrice, which is the community we're working with now, we're actually doing a lot more of the sustainability work. So I don't know if this is a question that you can answer right now, but what have you learned doing this process, being in the third iteration of it, that would have been helpful to you if you knew right before Hebron?
I think really the biggest thing for me is just the comfort of seeing the process play out in the long term, and seeing how really my job becomes easy, because all I have to do is, continue to engage the people that, and sometimes we have to come back to identifying their passions again, or reliving those things, or the things that they went through, the feelings they went through, the knowledge they learned through the summit, those types of things. But those are all there. It's all down somewhere. It's all documented. It's all come through this process. And so I love being on the other side of the process. And then as new communities come on and they say, this has taken a long time to get to this summit. Can't we just, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? How are we going to get there? And for me now to be able to just say, trust the process, because I promise you, I've seen the other side, and it is, it's amazing what can happen when you get that many voices together and build consensus with that many people, with all the same, passion of supporting their community. So I guess just the peace of mind.
Awesome. And we are getting ready to start wrapping up for the day. So I do want to say,
can I say one?
quickly.
Okay. Well, no,
are you unmuted, by the way?
I did unmute, yeah, but I can't say anything quickly. But I was wondering if anyone, Mary, I'm sorry, Mary, Jen, or Brian, anything on dialogue. We've talked a lot about small groups. Because dialogue is difficult, right? It needs a process to support it. I don't know. Any quick thoughts on how your organization handled dialogue and how the people handled it? But if not, that's okay. I know it's a weird question.
So that's an interesting question, and I would actually say, to me, I struggle sometimes because dialogue is actually so much easier when you're doing it in small groups, and when people try to have a dialogue with 20 people, it just doesn't become a dialogue for me. I have actually been called the jerk in a meeting that I am not running because we're sitting there listening to 20 people talk, and I get absolutely frustrated and bored. And so it's interesting to me, John, your question, because I was grouping the two, right? Like when I say dialogue, what I really mean is small group dialogue. But let's do this. Mary, Jen, then Brian, give us your final thought. If you're able to address John's question as part of that, let's do that. But let's start zooming in for our landing here. So 30 to 45 seconds each. What do you want to leave people with, or how do you answer John's question? Let's come to Jen first, then we'll go to Mary, then Brian.
I guess to answer John's question, really what I love about the process too is we kind of lay out the ground rules at the outset where everybody deserves the same voice and again, the beauty of the small groups is when you when you put your comments up on the board, you know, on the wall, and we have this whole process. When they get up there, they become anonymous, really, and it just becomes this idea that not necessarily someone that you liked said it or disliked said it. It just becomes an idea, and from that, I think it's really cool that people can see it objectively, and I love that part of it. So
awesome. We'll keep going. Mary, final thought?
Yeah. So for me, I'm going to answer John's question because this is a great question. When I in a group of people or training people, you know, accessibility often means that you have to develop a strategic plan and spend money on it and bring in a lot of different departments. So it has to involve dialogue. And so when I do trainings, I like to bring in kind of what Jen said. I do Google Forms because they're easy for me. They're accessible. I can look at them with my screen reader and post questions after different modules that people can submit, and then we can look at them all together. And usually having those thoughts, you know, sometimes people are super comfortable saying, that was me and this is what my worry is. And sometimes people are less comfortable, but still their opinion is being heard. So I think it's completely possible to have dialogues, even within a larger group, as long as you have a method of making sure that ideas are being heard and that they're not being biased by who says them, or also creating a safe space that, you know, things are not, you know, if you have a concern, voice it now so we can address it, and you don't like walk out of this room with that concern still in your head.
That is awesome, Mary. I really appreciate you sharing that. I'm so glad that you were on here to give that insight, because that is a really great answer to that question. Brian, we're going to come to you for a final thought, and then I'm going to take us out.
My final thought is more of a quote that I always hear Jeremy speak when we're engaging communities. When we're kind of setting the stage of the process, is everybody's truth is their truth, and try to see people's truth through other people's eyes. And so that always kind of hits me when we're trying to create the dialogue in the communities, and the welcomeness of the process, and how everybody brings their thoughts, their passions, their desires, their barriers to that discussion. And what the process does is allow for a safe space for people to be honest and open. And when there's that honesty and openness, that allows the process and the belief of change to actually come out even more. And so I think the process itself in creating that small group dialogue is just a fantastic opportunity. And I feel lucky enough being at the State Health Department to be able to be a part of and vision and see the other communities locally having these dialogues, struggling to have these dialogues, and then finding that kind of tipping point to say, yeah, we got to do this.
Well, thank you all three for coming on. And I think just the idea, again, of the power of small groups and dialogue, which I'm glad you asked that question, John, because they really are a little bit different, and we should be cognizant of that. But the power of using small group and dialogues as a way to increase the buy-in and ownership and the success of what you're trying to do, I think is one of the key takeaways from this. And as always, SNG Endeavors is here to help you in any way be able to structure your planning processes, your retreats, your meetings in a way that gives you the ability to engage people in that meaningful dialogue. You can get more information about our services by going to sgendeavors.com. You can also check out sgemediagroup.com, and I want to thank John and SGE Media for really running the background of this, and especially with John and Jerry helping to provide that promotional context, and also to run the board and make sure that we're broadcasting live and streaming. Contact SGE Media Group to really help you take your productions to the next level and think about how you are using virtual means to engage your audience in dialogue and discussion that's going to take your work to the next level. As always, you can go to sgeconnections.tv, and John, that might be wrong on our slide. It should actually be sgeconnections.tv, and we'll make sure we get that updated. That's an error on my part.
Yep.
sgeconnections.tv is where you can go see all of these episodes, and we'll be migrating Coffee with Jeremy over there as well. So I want to thank each of you for joining us today. A special thanks to Jen and Brian and Mary for coming on today. Having a discussion like this really helps me kind of get an opportunity to take a step back and think about the successes that you guys are having and what part we're playing in helping to make those happen. And so thanks everybody for a great show today. Please tune in toward the end of January when we'll continue our discussion on the power of design teams and how we use those to create the change and take the action that we want to see at our organizations. And be sure, again, like I said, to check our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages for when those shows will be coming up. We'll see you in late January. And thanks again for letting SNG Endeavors connect you to the things that will transform your work for success. See you next time on SGE Connections, and thanks everybody.